The big challenge right now with young people is being able to distinguish between just being uncomfortable, which is part of the gig of being a person, and when you're actually being threatened. Those are two very different things that we have conflated that is disastrous.
I think we miss sometimes with parenting that it's not just about us creating safety between us and them,
Right.
but also between them and the world at large.
You have kids who, go out into the world and they're confusing the experience of being uncomfortable at Starbucks with, like a saber-toothed tiger that might attack them.
What does effective discipline look like for children?
My big overall thing that you can say in your head when it comes to discipline is,
how can parents address lying and a lack of honesty?
If they're scared to tell you the truth because they're afraid of getting into trouble, no big deal if you have a 4-year-old. But when you have a 14-year-old and you could think about, Connor, what you were doing, you want them to know that.
All right. I was going to say Dr. Pressman. Can I call you Dr. Pressman? What do you prefer?
I think Aliza is just fine.
Aliza. Okay. Well, you never know. I like the formalities sometimes. Some people occasionally, like I had Franz de Waal on about a year and a half ago, who's like one of the premier primatologists. And he's like, sometimes people just want that formality. And I was like, okay, yep, fair enough. Well, I am excited to have this conversation with you because we're going to talk about all things parenting, developmental psychology, how we develop growing up. And I think that this is a beautiful topic that I have been diving into over the last number of years. So I'm excited to have this conversation. And where I want to begin is the ever-changing landscape that parents are in now and parents are going to be in the future. So from your perspective, what unique challenges do you think that parents are facing today that maybe, our parents didn't face when we were kids? And then what do you think parents 10 years from now are going to be facing that we're not facing in the present moment?
Well, one thing for sure is that the information, whether it's helpful or an inundation of sorts, information is coming at us as parents. By the way, I'm part of that. And so the benefit is that we kind of can do our best. The bad side of that is that we don't even know what information we're getting, whether it's accurate, whether it's reliable and valid, and we can start to question our own actual parental core and instincts. I don't know that was something that was an issue in the past. And of course, social media is a massive chunk of brain space for parents worrying. Maybe not when you have a 3-year-old, but certainly as we get older and also just as we're also living in it. So navigating our nervous system in this information age and parenting at the same time and kind of keeping some kind of sense of groundedness so that we can be present for our kids while all of this is going on is a challenge that, I don't think is going anywhere anytime soon. On the flip side, it's also, I think, totally resolvable if we come back to kind of what we can control ourselves. And I don't know that everybody remembers that, because that's another one of the things that's sort of happening right now is the lack of a sense that we actually are running a ship, and that's okay. So there's a beautiful conversation happening about how we come to be who we are and recognizing the experience of our children and our own experience being parented so that we can really be present and thoughtful and intentional in raising our kids. And also, I think it's making some parents, I think a lot of parents feel like, wait, so does that mean that boundaries and limits are a problem? I think that's a big confusion for this particular era.
Yeah, I think the inundation of information that's out there for parents, just like, anybody who maybe even if you listen to this and you're not a parent, and the amount of information that we're inundated with about change and growth and development and transformation and all the ways that you can like do this, don't do that. I mean, it's really, the volume of it can be so big that we can get sort of washed over with where to begin. And I think that's, when I was starting to do research around, kids and having kids and becoming a parent, there was again, the volume of information was so massive. And I love some of those, Instagram reels, because I don't go on TikTok. I think it's the bane of human existence, but
Yeah.
that's my personal
No, same. I'm not
perspective.
super into it.
I'm like, sometimes I haven't talked a lot about where I stand on some of these things as a parent, but I probably will in this episode. But I remember going onto Instagram and there's like those reels where there's like the gentle parenting conversations. And then there's like the parody ones, like the joke ones,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, I'm just going to need you to sit down and just shut up, just stop. And it's like, yeah, there's the like what you want to do. And then there's the reality every once in a while that sets in. But just to come back to the question. So one of the things that I hear you saying is that the volume of information for parents is very different than it used to be. There was sort of like some standard things that our parents probably used and heard about and learned about. And a lot of it was passed down generationally.
Mm-hmm.
And now people seem to be outsourcing it to social media quite a bit. So I think that's a big one. What do you think is going to be different for parents? If there's people that are listening that have young kids or that are going to be having kids in the future, what do you think parenting is going to look like? Or what are some of the challenges that you think are going to emerge in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think it'll be very interesting what goes on in the world of social media. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what direction this country goes in politically. And I think probably maybe this is wishful thinking, but there's no way to sustain this level of intensity around parenting. So I think there's going to be some natural, the pendulum just swings so much. And I feel like in the next decade, it has to come somewhere, like it has to resolve itself because it's unsustainable this way. We just can't be expected to be good while we're trying to be so perfect. I just don't see it being sustainable. So this might be a positive view, but I do think that we're going to figure out how to calibrate a little bit. Also, there is an idea that like everything has changed so much. And I hear all the time, like these revolutionary, this revolutionary science that's emerging about the brain or about relationships or whatever. When you look at the science, it has not changed. Like it's still the kernels of content that we actually need, the little bit that we know for sure. It's been the same for decades. It's not that different. I think like getting science from page to stage might take a decade or so, but it's not. To me, that's also heartening. Like no matter how much culturally the pendulum swings and no matter what might be going on social media, we still know that when someone says there's a parenting revolution going on, when you unpack what they're saying, they're like, we need to be both sensitive and have appropriate boundaries and limits. And that's called authoritative parenting or autonomy supportive parenting. And it's like that's been true for decades, since the 80s from a research perspective. So I love that because it feels a little bit less like we're doing, what are we doing this generation to the kids? But actually the science is like, we've been saying the same thing for decades. Like how that actually works out in the real world is a different story. But for me, that is very soothing.
Yeah, I like that. I like that notion because sometimes we get caught in the repackaging and repurposed marketing of things that, have kind of been true for a very, very long time.
That is exactly that. I wish I had said it that way. It's the repackaging and repurposing. of parenting content that is maybe making us have this illusion. But, I guess when combined with the fact that it's more available, there's just more content available, but it is repackaging and repurposing and remarketing of the
Hmm.
same stuff.
Interesting. I think one of the we'll probably come to that more later on in the conversation, but I think one of the things that I think quite a bit about as a parent, and that I think a lot of parents are not necessarily in terms of like direct parenting, but the sort of tertiary conversations that we need to have as parents is this big looming shift culturally, economically around AI, and the fact that because I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole around AI, and everybody that knows about AI and everybody that is very sort of like proficient and at the forefront of creating it is sort of touting it as something that is going to be so fundamentally altering to our culture and our society that they keep stating that, the world that our kids are going to grow up in is going to be so radically different from our own. And that, I think in some ways the previous generations had their own versions of that. I don't know if it was necessarily as in their face. I don't think that people could have predicted the changes that TV would have brought or that an iPhone would have brought. It's sort of hard to always predict and be able to prepare your kids for what that world is going to look like. But this is something that I've really been thinking a lot about because, my son's 3 now, and in a decade, the prediction is that AGI, artificial general intelligence, can be created by 2028, 2029. And so by the time he's 13 years old, 14 years old, you'll basically have this super intelligent thing in your pocket that can teach you and support you with pretty much anything. Like if he wants to learn quantum mechanics, he'll have a professor in his pocket that can teach him that, and it won't be a person, it'll be a program.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think about that kind of as a exponential fold of social media, right? It's like, how do you prepare your children for the onslaught of social media where you can use it in an effective way, but it can also use you in a sort of harmful way. And I think in some ways, one of the things maybe that is different today that is going to continue in the future is that we as parents have had to, we sort of have to prepare our kids to regulate their nervous systems in an environment where so many people have outsourced their nervous system to social media. And they've outsourced their nervous system to these platforms where they're constantly being dysregulated and they're constantly being overstimulated. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that. I know we're kind of getting off in the weeds of social media now, and like, how do you as a parent deal with that? But I'm curious about your thoughts on any of what I just said.
Well, I think all of what you just said speaks to the fact that we have to help develop the skills in our kids to be able to navigate all the onslaught of information. They need critical thinking skills because you need to make sure the professor in your pocket has reliable information. So bolstering executive function skills, I think, is probably our biggest charge, because if you think about all the skills housed in your prefrontal cortex, and just for the, everyone, that doesn't fully develop until you're in your, early, at the earliest 18, usually way later in your 20s. So that means all of childhood, you're operating with a growing area of the brain that houses your capacity for critical thinking and your capacity for self-regulation and your capacity for taking other people's perspectives and your capacity for communication and all of the things that are necessary when you talk about navigating the era of social media and AI. So since we can't possibly predict the technology or the direction that it's going in, I think we can focus on bolstering the skills to make us the kind of, having the kind of cognitive flexibility and critical thinking that makes it not as scary and overwhelming. Now, whether or not that's true, because we can't possibly know, we can at least know that our role as parents and just as, humans growing humans in this world, that we're doing the thing that we know how to do, which is support and bolster those growing executive function skills while we're navigating and managing our own nervous systems, and remembering the core of parenting isn't about like the procedural stuff that we get inundated with, like the tiny little minutia details that have no relevance to the long-term growth of our kids, but we get so fixated on, I think probably just to give us some sense that there's control in this world. But if we can focus on bolstering executive function skills and the sort of fundamentals of our own core of what we know is important in our parenting, I feel like that's the best we can offer to our kids and ourselves. And because we don't know how the AI experience is going to be, and we don't know what's going to happen socially, and we don't really know we don't even know the impact currently. Like, no matter what researchers say, we can't like randomly assign some young people, for example, social media, and some not social media, and see how they fare in the world. So a lot of the things that we say are based on what we think is going on, based on, some things that are happening alongside each other, like a lot more upticks in mental health challenges alongside the onset of social media. But we don't know, there's so much we don't know. So to me, I don't know if that even answered the question. From what we can do as parents and people is bolster executive function skills that'll help us navigate whatever gets thrown our way.
So, what are maybe just outline some of the executive function skills for the listener, and then we can talk about how do you actually build an environment and a sort of like infrastructure to help a child develop some of those skills. And I'm assuming that we have to kind of make sure that those things are in place for ourselves first and foremost. Right? It's a lot of emulation. Yeah. So let's just start there.
Really, parenting is nothing to do with the kids. It's like, it's just it's a repackaging of self-development. But so if you think of executive function skills as the air traffic control system of the brain, we want to, and you could think of the movie Inside Out. If anybody saw Inside Out, with all of the different characters that were running the system. So if this is the air traffic control system of the brain, and it has the capacity to have focused attention, so you're working on your attention skills, your working memory, and think of working memory as just like everything that we need to be able to make sense of the world. Like, working memory is the kind of thing where we can recall what directions, like how to follow what's happening in the world, where it's highly linked with IQ and intelligence. Attention is not just attention like I'm listening to, but it's what your behavior, your emotions, and your cognitive attention is going towards. So there's a lot. And then self-regulation, you're regulating not just your emotions, the emotion regulation, but your attentional regulation, your behavioral regulation, so that you have a goal-oriented capacity. Like, I have a goal, and my capacity to control my emotions to meet that goal, not in a sinister way, but like, instead of, throwing the Starbucks barista gets your order wrong and you want your coffee. So like, it's not super goal oriented to throw the cup at the barista, nor is it pro-social. So we're learning how to navigate the world that way. And perspective taking, which is this skill that develops like loosely. We have some concept of it around 4 years old. Before that, there's no sense that like you might have a different view of something. So in the silliest example of this, I love broccoli. I'm 3 years old. I can't use, if somebody says, do you love broccoli? does daddy love broccoli? My assumption is, well, if I love broccoli, he loves broccoli. And then you can see how the brain changes around 4 and 5 years old, where all of a sudden that child is like, well, I don't know. I let me imagine what this other person feels when they taste broccoli. I've seen before that they've kind of winced, so I think maybe they don't like it. That is seems like this tiny little developmental skill that is massive and keeps growing if we work on it. Because, right, how many adults do you know that don't have capacity? I just heard somebody, I was watching a movie with a big group of people, and I heard more than one person was sort of talking to the screen about, like, why did you do that? What, that's so obvious. Like, you should say this when that happens. And we all do that. Like when we're watching something, we're just like, what? That's such a stupid mistake. But the truth is, it's because we're assuming that everybody would act the way we would act in a particular moment. So that skill is super important, housed in, that's part of this executive function, this set of skills that are housed in your prefrontal cortex called executive function skills. And impulse control, like, again, something that seems kind of no big deal, is the difference between wanting to do something that could be bad for you and doing something that could be bad for you or someone else. And so, of course, when you see tiny little creatures, like your 3-year-old probably doesn't always have capacity to stop himself from doing the thing, right? But with developing with practice and a developing brain, all of a sudden you can stop your hand from like pulling the dog's tail or whatever it is.
Yeah, he's going through that right now.
There you go. And so there are things that
Yeah.
we can do to practice and grow those muscles, in quotes, so that by the time we get to 10 years from now, when we've got, your 3-year-old is now 13, and all of these challenges are coming his way, he has practiced for a decade growing the skills to focus, pay attention, his working memory, his impulse control, his capacity for self-regulation, like all the big stuff. So we think about like reading, writing, and arithmetic, but the bigger thing to work on, and frankly, the easier thing to work on, is self-regulation, attention, impulse control, like all the executive function skills. And by the way, as you said, these are skills that are the best thing we can do to bolster these skills in our kids is to bolster these skills in ourselves. So, the transition to parenthood is the third biggest growth in our brain. It's when our brain is the most plastic outside of early childhood and adolescence, where the two other much bigger brain growth happens. So that's because transition to parenthood, and this is true for fathers and mothers and caregivers. So it is the act of caregiving that we think changes the brain, not biological birth, because otherwise, how could we see this in fathers and adoptive parents and caregivers? But so given that, if we're bolstering these skills in ourselves during this transition to parenthood, then we're going to, of course, be giving a little boost to our young ones. It's the first time since we were younger that we really have these big challenges where we have motivation to not just walk away, but to actually grow.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different things in there that I think are super, super important.
So I just was like, bleh.
No, it's great. It's really, really good. I do the exact same thing. A couple of things that really stood out to me. Number one was impulse control. Number two was the capacity to regulate your own nervous system, and because a lot of the men that I work with that come out to whatever it is, some of what they're really struggling with is basic impulse control. And this is actually what I realized in hindsight, I really struggled with in my teens and 20s. I had zero impulse control. It was not something that I was taught. It was not something, it was like I would have a thought and I would do it. is like, I should jump my bike over that, flight of concrete stairs. And I was like, okay, let's go do that. Right. And that got me into all kinds of trouble as a kid because there just was no impulse control and there was no, regulated nervous system. But a lot of that, not to like pass the buck or the blame, but a lot of that was a byproduct of the environment that I was in, which was a seeing that there wasn't a lot of impulse control, a lack of teaching me how to actually have impulse control, and a use of like great force and punishment I, uh, when I would lack impulse control, like when I would do something ridiculous. And it's interesting because I watch my son right now and he's in this phase. Like, I mean, he was doing it right before I came down. There's a mirror there's these stairs that go up to the second level of our house. And there's a mirror that hangs on the wall on the stairs as you go up. And he yesterday started doing this thing where he lays down on the first stair and just starts to kick the wall. Oh. And the mirror isn't on there super well because when we hung it, like it missed the stud the first time and then put it in and whatever. And so, he's just got this impulse that he thinks it's funny to go and kick the wall because then the mirror hits the wall and it makes a sound. And so it's this game where he'll look at me and he'll go lay down on the stair and then he'll start kicking the wall. And he's like, what's going to happen? What are you going to do? And what I've noticed is that the more grounded, the more calm, the more firm that I am without being angry, because he's also started to, I noticed that he went through a period of asking me like, Dada, angry, Dada, are you angry? And so he's kind of like testing these waters, and it's interesting to see how it fits in developmentally within the first, 3 to 5 years. Cause he's testing the waters to see, can I do something I know you don't want me to do and still be all right? Or am I going to do something that you don't want me to do and get into a lot of trouble? And I noticed that the more trouble he thought he was in, the more proclivity he had towards going to do it again. And it was so fascinating at first because I was like, why are you doing that? And I had to laugh because I was like, oh man, this is just freaking parenting karma 101. Like this is like, I was like, oh, I did this exact shit as a child. Like this is exactly what I did. And now I'm just getting it in return, full spectrum, I definitely did all of that stuff. But the difference is that how I respond now as a parent is very, very different than the response that I got. And so it's just a very interesting thing to see that impulse control being built and test it out and tried out, and the regulation, like the regulated nervous system, and him tuning into me, like, are you angry? Are you not angry? Oh, you're not angry. Okay. Then we're just playing a game and I can stop, and so all of that unfolding. So I just wanted to share that story. And then I would love for you to maybe give the listeners some more like tactical insight. Like, how do we help our kids develop the impulse control? What can we do? Are there certain exercises that we can walk them through? And then secondly, how do we help them develop that more regulated nervous system? And obviously that's a big part of us, but I think that any insight exercises, stuff like that could be very, very helpful.
Okay. So I think there are two separate paths. The first is responding in the moment when there's like something going on, like the mirror might fall. And then there's the practicing of the skill, the skill building. So if you're talking about impulse control every day or 3 times a week or however often, not in the heat of the moment, playing certain games, like for a 3-year-old, I'll just give an example, putting like music on and doing freeze games or musical chairs or Mother May I. And if you see a pattern here, it's like all things where your body has the instinct to move forward, but you have to stop it. So those games that are from like a gazillion years ago, actually, and who knows if, like, I don't know if whoever started those games was so aware of how brilliant they were in terms of exercising those self-regulation muscles, the impulse control part. But any game that requires you to pay attention because you're going to have to shift and do something that your body doesn't want to do, again, like musical chairs, or even playing games like I Spy. Now, with a 3-year-old, that's really, like very basic. You would just do basic I Spy, but you're growing that capacity over time. And it gets, by 5 years old, just playing Simon Says every day can bolster that skill. So it's not unpleasant. Like giving impulse control exercises is not actually that unpleasant because you can do it through play. But anything, even the Candyland, like something that is, I'm just trying to think of like old school games that have directions that are something that you can follow by age 3. So any games where you have to remember a rule, abide by that rule, and experience the disappointment of, okay, I moved this, what's it called? The piece 2 squares forward. And now I'm disappointed because this is what's happening. Or now I'm excited because this is what's happening. All of that is fun, but also really exercising those muscles. And I think we lose out on that a lot of times during screen time and during the like very programmed days that kids tend to have now, because they're losing the sort of slow, very, it's not that exciting to do pick up sticks and freeze games, but those are phenomenal for building these skills. And, even chess. Chess is a fantastic game, which you could start at 3. There's actually a little very cute program, Chess at 3. But you can start with just pawns. And if you've never played chess before, you can learn how to play with your 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old, whatever. But again, because you have to plan in advance, you have to look at the board, you have to decide what move to make. These tiny little things having nothing to do with what you would, like in the heat of the moment, breathing and stopping your body from kicking a mirror is a totally different thing. But when you do those activities every day, every week, just in little moments, you are bolstering those skills. Okay, so separately, there is the heat of the moment. Like the mirror example is a great one where you notice that you were consistent and firm, but not moved. Like your nervous system was regulated enough so you could breathe and say, like, there's no emergency here. I just need to remain firm. I mean, in this case, there could be an emergency. So, it makes sense to take it really seriously and be firm each time. But that's going to be more effective if you're just like, I'm totally confident that the right decision is that you are not touching that. And also, I'm not afraid of telling you that. So my nervous system is totally in check. He's going to stop pushing because he gets it. He's like, I've tested, I've done the experiment. I get the same results every time. I'm moving on. And so for the majority of kids, they're going to move on after, 3 to 5 times trying the same thing and getting the same reaction. Because as a scientist, which they are, it's not that exciting.
Right.
But I think you named something that's very important there, which is you're not just keeping your nervous system in check, you're firm. So there's a confidence there that's not like overly there's not over attention to, I know you're really excited about kicking the mirror and I understand mirrors are really fun and it's wiggly and it's shaky. Like, this is not the time for that. There is a time and a place for that, but not when you're trying to teach a skill, like not sticking your finger in a socket or not kicking a mirror that could fall.
My thing is I have a tough time not laughing.
Yeah, because it's so cute.
Well, I think it's hilarious because I'm like, you're such a little shit sometimes. And then I'm like, oh man, I was such a shithead, like I was such a shithead as a kid. And I see so much of myself in him. And so whenever he's doing stuff like that, and he usually has this like goofy ass little grin on his face, right? He knows, he just like knows. And I think because for a while it became, like would become a game. But he knows. It's interesting because he now, like in the last several months, he can very much see, well, like when dad is serious, right? There's a difference between like, haha, this is funny. I'm
Yeah.
going to come over, like this morning, the first time he was on the stairs and he's kicking the wall, I came over, I like picked him up by his ankles and like threw him onto the couch, right? And he thinks that's fun. And so he's right back there and that's part of the game. And then it's like, okay, that's enough. Like we don't do that anymore. And I've noticed that like when my tone shifts, and it's not in like a threatening way, it's just like, this is enough.
Hmm.
He responds very, very well to that. And but if I swing too much and I do start to get angry, he also really responds to that. And so it is very interesting to see how, um, I don't know what the right word is for it, but like how much their nervous system is just wiring to ours.
That's
That
co-regulation.
yeah,
Like
yeah, 100%.
that is such a beautiful observation because they co-regulate with us. They borrow our nervous system, and so we have to focus on our nervous system in order for them to borrow the nervous system we're hoping they borrow.
So talk to me about some of the core pieces that are happening inside of us, because I want the listener to put themselves into the seat instead of their kids. So talk to me about some of the core pieces that are happening developmentally in the first few stages of life. So like 0 to 5. I know that there's sort of like there's pre-birth, and then there's 0 to 18 months, and then 18 months to 3, and then 3 to 5. But like, talk to me about what's developing there. What are some of the primary things that an individual might need to know about in terms of their own developmental interruptions, and what to look for? Because I've found that a lot of the times when it comes to individuals' work and therapy, we often look at the things that we can remember, and we almost always, a lot of therapy overlooks what happened pre-verbal, which are oftentimes some of the most important
Mhm.
developmental stages. So I think it's good to contextualize this for
Yeah.
people listening.
Okay. So when you think about even the experience of um, those early weeks and years yeah, as you said, you can't remember the first couple of years. And I was actually trying to help parents understand this during the pandemic. It was really hard for new parents because they were so overwhelmed, and also they were worried about socialization. And I was like, oh, this is actually the golden time for you, because all these little babies need is their little tiny primary circle. And they don't need the outside world yet. They just need to feel safe with their family. The end. Like there's absolutely no need for anything else for those first couple of years. Certainly after like 18 months, just because we are social beings, you want to introduce just the experience of others. But it's like in that first chunk of time, we're talking about helping them feel safe and secure emotionally and physically in their little tiny universe. And they don't yet need the bigger world. And they're getting so many of their cues from our nervous system, from our facial expressions, from our, the language. So much of the language is developing, even if they're not speaking, they're listening, and it's the receptive language, what they're understanding, that's more important than what they would be saying. And I really love this period because it's so heartening to see how wired they are for having a secure attachment relationship, and how our job, and I know that, you know one of the things that is true for us to constantly keep in mind is attachment isn't just formed and then it's just there forever, or not formed and doesn't come around. It's really dynamic. And so, yes, during these early years, you are establishing the hopefully secure attachment relationship with your child. And also, if you aren't feeling connected, if you aren't feeling like you can be consistent, and consistent just means more often than not, it doesn't mean constantly. And just like as a sidebar, it's super important for people to know that all of the research on attachment, like when Ed Tronick, who kind of created what a very famous still face paradigm and many studies on attachment relationships, when he calculated, this is going to sound so technical, but like when he looked at the amount of times the parent-child dyad was connected and attuned, it was 33% of the time. And the issue was not how much you were attuned as like a measure of secure attachment. It was what the rest of the time, the 2/3 of the time that you were not attuned, was that repair and discord and repair and discord? Or was it just discord, detachment, not connection, not coming back together? But I think that it's worth naming because when I say that this early period is about the safety and the emotional connection and establishing that attachment relationship, I just want to be clear, it's not being attuned constantly. There's no human that is like that. Not a couple, as you know, not a parent-child dyad. It's about some of the time being attuned and some of the time coming back from misattunement. So that's happening early on, and that's the real focus, is feeling like you're getting to know each other and you are safe and there's consistency. And so this is a child who feels like I can explore out in the world because I'm not worried about when I'm getting my next meal or my next hug or a good night's sleep. And then as they become toddlers, they're meant to test the waters. And we're like, hopefully, we've established this sturdy foundation from which they can explore and be, like the rebel that you were, because they know that when they, turn back as they're kind of crawling away or toddling away, that they turn around and you're still there waiting. And you're also there to give them that look when they've gone too far. So, getting to that 3-year-old and preschooler, like they're testing, and they keep checking in with you, and if you don't let them know what the guardrails are, why would they know? That's their whole job, is to figure that out, and our whole job is to help them understand. So if we were making such tight controlling guardrails that they had no space to explore, that would be overwhelming and overly controlling. But if we give them no guardrails and it's just like, you're young and free, enjoy, they would not even survive. So like, it's not a good idea. So we have that, like, I think our parent development during the toddler preschool years is very much about toggling between the sensitive caregiving that we have and really getting strong and true with our guardrails, our boundaries, and our limits. So that we can help them grow while still making sure they feel safe. And all of this, our whole lives, all of our relationships are some way of saying, hey, I love you, you're safe emotionally and physically, and my job is going to be to keep you safe emotionally and physically, and then also give you the space and freedom to be able to grow in that safe emotionally and physically space.
Mm. Yeah, I think I was recently listening to Jonathan Haidt, and
Well,
he's got
that ought
some
to
really
put you into a panic.
right. Yeah, no doubt. A lot of the stuff that he's talking about with regards to social media and its impact on kids, and but I do think one of the things that is super important that he talks about is this notion of like free play, and I like what you're talking about as well. This toggling back and forth between a sense of autonomy, having a sense of freedom, but then also coming back into a place where there are constraints, and having that like experience from a spectrum, of differing degrees of limitations and then differing degrees of freedom, I think are super, super important. Like we are very fortunate. We live on like 5 acres of land and we have trees all around us. And so my son is outside constantly.
So
And
good.
yeah, he's just like running around, and he's got these trucks outside, and just recently we've started to give him the space to like, go outside into the front yard on his own and have some of that space. And it's been interesting to watch him, because at first, the first couple of times that I did it, he didn't leave the front porch, right? Like he wouldn't, he was just like in the front, sort of like right there, right beside the front door. And, and that was good for him. And then he kind of ventured off a little bit further, and a little bit further. And now he's got a little bit of like a lay of the land, but he's still got his spots. And then he comes back to the house.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
such a
it's
great
really,
example.
yeah. And so it's cool to see that sort of like free play and the trust and the safety and the security. I do every once in a while have the like thought in my head of like, there's probably coyotes out here somewhere, and then behind us, there's just hundreds or thousands of acres of forest. I'm like, do I need to put an air tag in one of his shoes and,
Oh my God.
track him? But I think that's probably a couple of years away before he starts to like really try and
Run.
wander off into the wilderness.
But I think it's a great example, first, just because we really don't feel safe anymore just letting our kids explore and play. And also, we just feel like it's a waste of time, which I think is more, I'm not even sure which is worse, but I think that part is worse, is that, I think reframing free play as the absolute crux of development and learning and growing versus wasting time until there's something that's productive going on. Even I was thinking about how this happens more with boys typically, but like roughhousing is so important for impulse control and self-regulation. But we're so like afraid of the roughhousing that we stop it. And I remember this story. I think this roaming free outside just made me think of it. But I remember I remember going to the park. I mean, it was Central Park because we were in New York City. It's a little harder, the roaming free thing there, but you still like, I think those city kids are really good at like walking the streets by themselves and figuring out how to stop at the stoplight. So it's a skill. But we were in Central Park, and there were these two brothers that were just like really roughhousing, but they knew like when it was too far because they'd practiced roughhousing all the time. And then another set of siblings came, and these two brothers were not allowed to roughhouse because there was no violence allowed. And it was a totally well-meaning rule. I get why you would have that rule, but they were getting tackled by the other pair of brothers. And so the mom looked sort of like nervous. And I have this habit of watching everything like everyone is a safari creature. And so I'm not saying anything, but I'm just kind of fascinated. And it was so interesting because the two boys who were not allowed to roughhouse got so red-faced and looked like terrifying, because I think their whole nervous system felt threatened and attacked, and they didn't know what to do with that much being stimulated that much. So they were just off the rails. Whereas the two that had been doing it for years in these tiny ways were not moved. It was just fun. It was letting loose. And it was to me, it was so, it illustrated so much how we've got to be free to play and to do the things so that we don't end up so confined that we explode when we are given access to any freedom.
Yeah, or expect other people's to alter their behavior to ensure our safety, right? Because that seems to be
true.
a huge part of the problem
now
in the culture today, which is
yes.
I need you, like, you have to change. You have to do this. You have to talk like this. You can't do this. You can't do that because otherwise I don't feel safe. And it was interesting because I just attended one of the biggest psychology conferences in North America. And I was talking to a really a wonderful, wonderful therapist, Dr. Alexander Solomon, and some of her colleagues. And it was interesting to hear people in the university environment that are professors talking about a fear of not having everyone feel included because that is deemed as harmful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if you're not included, that's harmful. Or if you say something wrong, that's harmful. And it's just so wild to me that we've gotten to this place where, and your story is such a like potent example of that, right? Of like when you haven't done the roughhousing, like the physical roughhousing, then we can get into a space where saying the wrong things can be construed as like dangerous to us, you know? And don't get me wrong, there are things that are very real threats, you know, like if somebody threatens you
But we
physically,
have to
that's
be able to
very different.
distinguish. Yes,
That's
I
right.
think
Yeah.
that is the big challenge right now with young people is like being able to distinguish between just being uncomfortable, which is part of the gig of being a person, and when you're actually being threatened and threatening. And those are two very different things that we have conflated that is disastrous. That conflation is disastrous.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, I mean, the free play is so, some of my favorite memories and experiences as a kid were just being outside in the backyard with a little shovel or a hatchet, you know, and like just screwing around, digging holes, you know, chopping down little trees and yeah, playing make believe and having like my own little place in the backyard that I like curated in the woods.
Yes,
And
I have
and
that
then
too.
bringing my friends there and you
Yeah.
know all of that was just so. And I think what it does now that I've you know gone down the path of developmental psychology a bit is it creates a sense of safety in the world, you know, that there's like a knowingness that the world is, you know, of course there's dangers in the world, but that largely the world is a safe place to be. And when you take that away, you almost take away one of the fundamental pieces of what it means to be a human, because then you're walking out in the world in a city, in Starbucks, in a restaurant, and your system's like, oh shit, am I safe? Am I
Yeah.
okay?
What do I do
This
here? And totally.
constant thing, you know? And so when you strip that out, it's like fucking no wonder so many people have social anxieties that are
Yeah,
running
it's
rampant and they can't go to the
exhausting.
coffee shop. It's like, it's this exhausting thing where your nervous system is like, am I okay? Even though I'm in a
Totally.
Starbucks.
It's so exhausting. And we have to, like, I have such compassion for what's happened to like young. This is very much like, I think, a reaction to a well meaning, I need to make sure that my child is comfortable and safe. And we've confused safety, like emotional safety doesn't mean you're always going to be happy, for God's sakes. You know, you're always going to be comfortable. That would be ridiculous. But we've gotten so confused. And then you have kids who, you know, go out into the world and they're confusing the experience of being uncomfortable at Starbucks with, you know, like a saber-toothed tiger that might attack them.
Yes, 100%. So it's interesting because with some of the guys that I've worked with over the years, when we talk about their youth and they talk about feeling constricted and not having free play or not being able to be outside, I will literally assign them to go on an excursion out in nature, or I'll say, you need to go camping for 2 days solo. And it's going to be confronting. And I remember one of the guys, the first time I actually ever assigned it to a client, I said, you're going to go spend one night out in the wilderness by yourself. You're going to get the tenting gear and whatnot, get everything that you think you need. I can help you figure out exactly what you need, but you're going to go spend a night out in the wilderness. And this is like a 45-year-old man, right? And this guy's like, okay. And it was so interesting because I led him up to it, and then he went and he came back and we had a session like the week after, and he said, I couldn't do it. He said, I can't believe how afraid I was. I got out there, I parked my car, I started to walk off in the wilderness, and I became terrified. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Like a really good first step. And so he was like, but I want to do it again. Like there's something exciting about it. And it was, the unknown and blah, blah, blah. And so he went off and had round number 2, and he spent one night out there. And, he was like, I think I only got like 4 or 5 hours of sleep because I was up all night. Like, are there bears out here? And am I going to be safe? And like all that kind of stuff. And so it was just such an interesting thing. But over time, it became something that he like really loved and appreciated. And it was wild how much his sense of safety in his marriage, in his family system, in his work environment, his sense of his ability to trust other people all started to shift, because suddenly he had this internal knowing of like, oh, I'm safe in the world.
Yeah.
And like, I'm safe in nature. I'm safe in this unknown environment where there are a lot of things that can go wrong or go sideways or whatever. But that, I think when we take that from kids, it's like I think we miss sometimes with parenting that it's not just about us creating safety between us and them, but
Right.
also between them and the world at
World.
large, and nature, specifically nature.
Yeah.
So thoughts on that before we move forward to the next
I
little
just
piece?
agree.
That's
my thought.
okay, well, good. It's, I'm taking my son camping for the first time this year. I'm so excited,
Oh,
and it'll be very interesting. So I'm going to test it here at home first. I'm going to set up the tent outside,
that's
and
so great.
and we're going to sleep outside, and then I'm going to take him to Maine, and go camping for like 4 days in Arcadia National Park. And so it'll be a fun adventure to see how it goes. It'll be his first time sleeping outside and like going to bed in a tent. I
Oh,
think he's
that's
gonna,
so great.
yeah,
I so regret. I mean, my kids are older teenagers, so it's tricky. Um, I so regret not doing that early because it's so confidence building. And so, because confidence comes from competence and like having experienced these things and recognizing what, like just the capacity to understand the difference between real and imagined threat. Like these are all things that you can do with those kinds of experiences over time in your younger years. But now, I recently just said to my 17-year-old, I was like, I think you should do one of those NOLS courses. And she was like, not doing one of those NOLS courses and about to turn 18. So it's a harder sell when you can't force something. But I was thinking, oh, I didn't do that with you when you were younger. And now it's another one of those things you don't realize you can do. You can be safe
mm,
doing that and uncomfortable and all of the things.
yeah,
City
yeah.
kids.
And I think there's like a usefulness that kids, like I remember being a child and I wanted to be very useful. I wanted to like know how to do things, and I wanted to feel proficient at them. And it was wildly frustrating. And I know that that's part of the developmental stage, right? It's like you get to sort of like 5 years old, and then all of a sudden you're like, wow, how much can I actually do? And then like, how well can I do these things?
Yeah.
And, that is such an important piece that I think we often overlook. Like with my son, he's incredibly intrigued by like, how do we start a fire? And like, what do we do? And so now he knows all the steps,
That's
right? Of
so
like, you
cool.
put the paper in and then you put the wood in. And so he's like, he knows the whole process and he's very much into it. But okay, let's shift a little bit. Cause otherwise I'm just going to talk about how much I love my son the entire podcast. Let's shift a little bit and talk about discipline and then sleep. So let's talk about discipline first, because I think this is something that has had a lot of conversation over the last number of decades. What does discipline look like for a child? What does effective discipline look like for children? And where are the boundaries for that? Like, what are some of the territories that we maybe shouldn't get into that we know can be detrimental developmentally?
Okay, so I have like a one sentence discipline version, and then like in my book I did kind of choose your own adventure. There's discipline that tends to work more often. There's discipline that doesn't work as well, but is very popular. And there's stuff that's like straight up not good idea. But there's flexibility within all of that. But I would say like my big overall like thing that you can say in your head when it comes to discipline is all feelings are welcome, all behaviors are not. That's like the big picture of discipline. So that means at every moment you can ask yourself, did I recognize, honor, whatever, validate the feeling? Did I curb, give a limit to, have guardrails for the behavior? Check, check. You've done your job. The end. Like, so that's the big picture for discipline, which goes for a 3-year-old or a, 13-year-old. And I know I'm making it sound overly simple, except it kind of is.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like that also relates to us as adults, like layer that over for us as adults.
Yeah, it really simplifies everything. And I think when we go back to that, how simple it all is, what's hard is doing it because we're people and we have feelings that get in the way of our how we move through the world. But if you keep having that core of, okay, ultimately, what is my job here? I need to figure out what my child needs in this moment. I need to figure out what I need. Because sometimes you don't have the bandwidth for the discipline that is required for certain moments. So you do have to recognize your own bandwidth. And for example, this is a minor example, but if somebody says to me they have a 13-year-old, they're ready to give them social media, but they're not ready to check in on it and monitor it and help them along, I'm like, then they're not getting it, because you have to both be ready, and you don't have the bandwidth for it. So like, that's part of discipline, is recognizing your bandwidth. And you can, when it's a 13-year-old, you can just say that I actually think you might be ready to try this out. I'm not ready. I have to be available for this. But with it, but I think thinking developmentally, younger kids operate with a system that's pretty simple when it comes to discipline. Like, they want to please you, and they want to not get in trouble, and they associate like right and wrong in the world with what is allowed and what's not allowed. So they're not looking at like deeper meaning behind things. So sometimes we attribute deep meaning, and we're like, well, if you're just focused on compliance, you're going to have a kid who's constantly just focused on compliance for their whole lives. A 3-year-old is focused on compliance because that's developmentally where they are. Whereas a 7-year-old is not. Like, compliance is not their primary goal. They're really trying to understand things in a different kind of way. And you have to be very careful about being focused on compliance, because you're going to end up potentially, if you only focus on compliance, getting a kid who's like really good at following directions, but isn't really good at figuring out how to make a good choice in the absence of directions. So I think part of understanding discipline is thinking clearly about where your child is developmentally. Ideally, as our kids get more freedom, so they're now we're not talking about a 7-year-old, we're talking about a 17-year-old. They're basically free in the world, with the exception of the really fundamental rules that you've laid out that are still in place in your households. But for the most part, they don't have to check with you. Like, your 3-year-old needs to find out if he's allowed to have a snack. My 17-year-old is not like, hey, mom, can I have a snack right now? Like, that would be weird and over the top. So recognizing that, okay, an emerging adult, I need to pull back as much as possible, but with the guardrails that really, really matter, both to her fundamental safety, but also to my household values. Like, that's kind of a big deal too. So one of the other components of discipline, apart from all feelings are welcome, all behaviors are not, and like, here's my expectation. And if you don't meet that expectation, there's a natural or a logical consequence. Not punishment. Punishment, as we all know, doesn't really get you, like, it feels in the moment like, yeah, I showed my child this cannot happen again, but then it happens again because that's just punishment doesn't really work. But I think it's important to recognize that we have to also discipline within the context of our values. So, like, I don't know what your values are, and I wouldn't presume to know what anybody's values should be. I think we have like a basic understanding of the goodness stuff, but I really encourage people to come up with a personal value statement and a family mission statement. This is not my opinion. This comes from research that came long before me, and I'm just delivering it in a, maybe an easier to understand way, going back to repackaging. Um, but I think you have to say, like, in this household, we value, these three things above all else, so that in the context of discipline, you have your day-to-day discipline so that you have easier bedtime routines and you know not to kick the mirror. And then you have your big picture values discipline where you're like, actually, kindness is one of our top three values in this household. So if you use dehumanizing language, we're going to say something and we're going to have a conversation about it. So that's, but if you had 13 or 20 values that were so important to your family, it would start to lose its weight.
I like that notion of having the values and then the values of the family system and then the sort of like motto, of what we stand for. I think that's pretty important. I think as I was listening to you, one of the challenges that a lot of parents have is around lying. That kids start to get into a place where they realize that they, can lie and not tell the truth. And that can cause a lot of disruption within the system. And so obviously you can have the value of honesty, but how can parents address lying and a lack of honesty? I'm curious about that.
So lying's a funny one because developmentally it's a process. So like, for example, when we were speaking earlier about that moment around 4 years old when kids can all of a sudden have what's called theory of mind. They understand that you think you might have a different perspective from their perspective. Your mental state might be different from theirs. Along with that realization comes the realization that you might not know that I had a bite of chocolate cake that I wasn't supposed to have. So now I can tell you that I didn't, which is lying, but then I won't get in trouble. And so in the beginning, lying is both a sign of cognitive, like a huge cognitive moment of growth. So for the littles, I would say, don't panic. That is actually a sign of intelligence. And we just need to, help our kids understand that they can tell us the truth, even when the truth might be something that we don't want to hear, and that we can handle it and that they can handle the consequences. And also, we tend to set our kids up to lie. So looking at ourselves, and this is not to blame parents, it's more to empower parents to say that they can control a lot of this, which is, how do I respond to lying? And am I setting my kid up to lie? For example, am I saying, did you eat the cake? If I know that you ate a piece of chocolate cake, why am I asking you? Just say, I see you ate the cake and we had talked about not eating it. What do you think happened? What was going on for you? Like, so that you're teaching them you can find out they did something wrong and the world does not end. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't natural consequences or logical consequences, but it does mean that they see that lying isn't the path to take with you. And the reason we need them to really, really understand that is if they're scared of you, if they're scared to tell you the truth because they're afraid of getting into trouble. Now we're talking about no big deal if you have a 4-year-old, but when you have a 14-year-old and you could think about, Connor, what you were doing, like, you want them to know that truth is better than putting themselves in harm's way. So if we are too focused on being afraid of the lying and the telling of the truth and all of that, we can get ourselves in a situation where our kids are not able, they don't feel like they can tell us the truth. So setting our kids up to tell the truth is hugely important. Noting that we can instill the value of telling the truth through the way we live our lives in front of our kids, especially, and distinguishing over time between white lies, which are considered kind of pro-social lies, like when somebody says, thank you, I loved it, about a gift, is not the same thing as snuck out of the house and I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to get in trouble and I'm lying to you. Or I said I brushed my teeth, but I didn't brush my teeth all week. And, like, I will give you another example just because I think people don't realize how often we actually set people up to lie to us. But in your tone, if you say, did you brush your teeth before bed? Right. And your kid says, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then 5 days go by and you're like, I'm going to check the toothbrush. The toothbrush is dry as a bone. It has not been used for days. But now my kid has told me 4 days in a row they've brushed their teeth. So if I say to them, did you brush your teeth? They're not going to say no, because then I might be like, what? So instead, we say, I noticed the toothbrush is dry. You didn't brush your teeth this week, but I told you to brush your teeth this week and you had said you were going to brush your teeth this week. So now let's just do it together so you don't have to be in the position of not doing it and lying to me about it. So we're really just getting information when our kids lie, for the most part, especially the younger kids, of how much more do they need to be able to tell us the truth? Like, where are they at developmentally so that they can let us know, hey, I probably need some more monitoring here than I've let on.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's very, very helpful because I think for a lot of parents, they can struggle when the child starts to lie, and then it can go sideways and become a very like prominent feature within the family system, and then within that individual's life, and I think like a lot of the guys that I've worked with where they're like, we had there's a couple guys at the last men's retreat that I ran, and one of the guys was like, I've just lied for so long about so many things and I do not know why. I don't know why I have to lie so much. And when we got into it, it was a lot of like shame oriented punishment
Right.
when he was very young around lying. So
And
yeah.
I think shame punishment is like you're punished for who you are. So now you're a
Right.
liar instead of a person who lied. There's a big difference between being a liar and being told you lied in that moment. Sounds like you were worried about what that you would get in trouble or whatever. And like having some compassion while still saying, hey, lying is not okay and we're working on this. That's a
Yeah.
very different thing. The other thing that story reminds me of is just in general that we have to unpack our own relationship with lying, because when a 3-year-old or 4-year-old is lying to you, are you then saying, oh my God, if I don't nip this right now, like this reminds me of what I was like. And when I was 15, I lied so much to my parents, I nearly died, like whatever it is that is your own baggage, to recognize like, this is just a moment. This is just a moment. And I don't need to write the whole future from this moment.
Love that. Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to pause. There's so much more around parenting that we could get into, but we're gonna have to pause for today. Where can people go to find out more about your work and to grab a copy of your book? Where can they head?
I have a website, Dr. Aliza. Oh my God, I don't even know what my website is. I'm like, is it Dr. Aliza Pressman or draliza.com? Anyway, you
We'll
can
put it in
also,
the show notes.
and I'm on Instagram on @RaisingGoodHumans podcast. My book is called The 5 Principles of Parenting, and you can get it anywhere. Obviously, a local bookshop like bookshop.org is great, but it is on sale on Amazon for 42% off. So I totally get that seems like a better spot.
That's always helpful. And it's draliza.com.
Thank you.
DRALIZA. We'll have the links for that in the show notes. That was the best. That's the best. I love when people are so not self-promotional that they're like, I actually don't. Where should people go? That's good stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I had a blast. I think people probably got a lot from it. And we'll have to have you back on another time to dig deeper into the art and the science of parenting and developmental psychology. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody. Don't forget to man it forward and share this episode with somebody that would appreciate it. Maybe this is something that you listen to with your partner, whether you have kids or not. This could be very, very formative in a lot of ways. So until next time, Connor Beaton signing off.